The candlelight flickered across the weathered pages as Niccolò Machiavelli set down his quill in the modest farmhouse outside Florence. The year was 1513, and the former secretary of the Florentine Republic found himself in exile, stripped of power and influence, yet paradoxically closer to understanding the brutal mechanics of human nature than ever before. In the silence of his study, surrounded by the ghosts of political failures and the echoes of empires risen and fallen, he contemplated a truth so stark it would scandalize generations: that human stupidity was not merely an obstacle to effective governance, but the very foundation upon which all political power rested. The evening air carried the scent of olive groves and the distant sound of peasants returning from their fields. These simple folk, Machiavelli mused, represented the vast majority of humanity, driven by immediate needs, swayed by emotion over reason, and blissfully unaware of the complex machinations that shaped their lives. Yet it was precisely this predictable simplicity that made them governable. The prince who understood this fundamental truth could wield power with surgical precision, while those who clung to idealistic notions of human rationality would find themselves swept away by the very currents they failed to comprehend. As he gazed into the dancing flames, Machiavelli recalled his years serving Cesare Borgia, that magnificent and terrible example of princely ambition. Borgia had possessed an intuitive understanding of human weakness that bordered on the supernatural. He knew when to inspire fear and when to offer hope, when to appear merciful and when to demonstrate ruthless efficiency. Most importantly, he understood that the masses desired not freedom or enlightenment, but the illusion of security and the comfort of being told what to believe. This was not cynicism speaking, but cold observation refined through years of witnessing the collision between political theory and human reality. The first great truth that emerged from Machiavelli's contemplation was this: the majority of human beings actively resist the burden of independent thought. They seek leaders not to guide them toward wisdom, but to relieve them of the exhausting responsibility of making complex decisions. This tendency was not a failure of education or circumstance, it was a fundamental feature of human psychology that transcended class, culture, and epoch. The merchant who could calculate complex trade routes with mathematical precision would surrender his political judgment to whoever spoke with sufficient confidence. The scholar who could parse the subtleties of ancient texts would follow charismatic demagogues who offered simple explanations for complex problems. In the courts of Italy, Machiavelli had witnessed this phenomenon countless times. Intelligent men and women, capable of sophisticated reasoning in their areas of expertise, would become credulous children when confronted with political rhetoric that appealed to their emotions. They would abandon careful analysis in favor of narratives that confirmed their existing prejudices or offered them convenient scapegoats for their frustrations. The skilled prince learned to recognize these patterns and exploit them with the same dispassionate efficiency that a sailor reads the wind. Consider the case of Pope Alexander VI, Cesare Borgia's father, whose reign demonstrated the perfect synthesis of spiritual authority and ruthless pragmatism. Alexander understood that the faithful did not truly want a humble shepherd who would challenge their comfortable assumptions, they wanted a figure of magnificent authority who would absolve them of their sins while demanding nothing more taxing than ritual observance and financial contribution. By projecting divine authority while indulging in very human appetites, Alexander gave his subjects exactly what they craved: a god who understood their weaknesses and forgave their failures without requiring genuine transformation. The Pope's success revealed another crucial aspect of human stupidity: its relationship with self-deception. People possessed an remarkable capacity to believe contradictory things simultaneously, provided those beliefs served their immediate emotional needs. They could condemn corruption in abstract terms while supporting corrupt leaders who promised them personal benefits. They could praise virtue while rewarding vice. They could demand truth while punishing those who delivered uncomfortable revelations. This cognitive flexibility was not a bug in human psychology, it was a feature that allowed individuals to navigate complex social environments without the paralyzing burden of perfect consistency. But, for those who sought to understand and direct human behavior, this tendency represented both opportunity and obligation. The prince who recognized the malleable nature of human belief could shape it like clay, creating the very reality he wished to govern. Machiavelli's observations extended beyond the realm of politics into the broader patterns of human folly that manifested in every sphere of existence. In matters of war, he had seen seasoned commanders abandon sound strategy in favor of romantic notions of honor that led directly to defeat. In commerce, he witnessed merchants pursue ventures doomed by wishful thinking rather than careful analysis. In diplomacy, he observed negotiators sabotage their own interests through emotional reactions to perceived slights. The common thread in all these failures was the triumph of immediate gratification over long-term thinking. Humans were remarkably adept at complex reasoning when the stakes were low or abstract, but, when faced with decisions that threatened their comfort, security, or self-image, they reliably chose the path that felt good in the moment regardless of its ultimate consequences. This was not merely intellectual weakness, it was a form of willful blindness that served psychological needs even as it undermined practical outcomes. The second profound truth that crystallized in Machiavelli's mind concerned the relationship between intelligence and wisdom in matters of governance. He had known many brilliant individuals who possessed vast knowledge and sophisticated analytical capabilities, yet consistently made disastrous political decisions. Conversely, he had observed seemingly simple leaders who, through intuitive understanding of human nature, achieved remarkable success in managing complex societies. The key distinction lay not in raw intellectual capacity but in the willingness to accept uncomfortable realities about human nature. The brilliant fools insisted on treating people as they ought to be rather than as they actually were. They crafted elegant theories based on assumptions of rationality, justice, and mutual goodwill that had no basis in observed human behavior. When their policies inevitably failed, they attributed the failures to external circumstances rather than flawed premises. The wise prince, by contrast, began with the assumption that most people were motivated primarily by self-interest, fear, and the desire for social acceptance. He crafted his approach to governance around these realities rather than fighting against them. Where the idealistic reformer saw corruption and sought to eliminate it through moral exhortation, the practical ruler recognized corruption as a predictable outcome of human nature and designed systems that channeled it in useful directions. This approach required a form of moral courage that most people found deeply uncomfortable. It meant acknowledging that the noble rhetoric of political discourse bore little relationship to the actual forces that shaped human behavior. It meant accepting that lasting change came not through inspiring speeches about human potential, but through careful manipulation of incentives and consequences. Most importantly, it meant abandoning the comforting fiction that good intentions were sufficient to produce good outcomes. The Italian city-states provided a perfect laboratory for testing these principles. Florence, with its republican ideals and merchant-class governance, represented the triumph of theory over practice. The Florentine elite genuinely believed in the possibility of rational self-governance, and they structured their institutions accordingly. They created elaborate systems of checks and balances designed to prevent the concentration of power while encouraging deliberative decision-making. Yet Florence's history was a catalogue of missed opportunities and strategic blunders. The Republic's decision-making process was so cumbersome that it could rarely respond effectively to rapidly changing circumstances. Its leaders were so concerned with maintaining the appearance of virtue that they consistently failed to take the decisive action necessary for survival in a world of predatory neighbors. When crisis struck, the Florentines invariably turned to strongmen who promised to cut through the paralysis of consensus building, only to discover that they had traded their cherished independence for the very authoritarianism they had sought to avoid. Across the peninsula, Venice demonstrated a different model, one that acknowledged human weakness while creating structures that limited its most destructive effects. The Venetian Constitution was a masterpiece of practical psychology that recognized the inevitability of faction and ambition while channeling these forces in productive directions. Rather than pretending that men could be trusted with unlimited power, the Venetians created a system of rotating offices and mutual surveillance that made large-scale corruption difficult while preserving the flexibility necessary for effective governance. The Venetian model succeeded not because it expected better behavior from its citizens, but because it expected worse. Every position of authority was designed with the assumption that its occupant would seek personal advantage at the expense of the common good. By creating counterbalancing incentives and overlapping jurisdictions, the Venetian system harnessed human selfishness in service of collective prosperity. Yet even Venice's sophisticated approach could not completely overcome the fundamental limitations of human nature. The Republic's decline began precisely when its leaders started believing their own propaganda about Venetian superiority and moral excellence. Success bred complacency, and complacency bred the very weaknesses that Venice's constitution had been designed to prevent. The descendants of shrewd merchants became entitled aristocrats who valued ceremony over substance and tradition over adaptation. As Machiavelli reflected on these patterns, he began to perceive the cyclical nature of human folly. Societies that achieved prosperity and stability through practical wisdom would inevitably produce generations who took that success for granted. These fortunate inheritors would mistake the fruits of careful calculation for evidence of natural superiority or divine favor. They would gradually abandon the hard-won insights that had made their success possible, replacing practical wisdom with comfortable illusions. The process was as predictable as the changing of seasons. Hardship produced leaders who understood the necessity of clear thinking and difficult choices. Success produced leaders who could afford the luxury of idealistic thinking. Idealistic thinking produced policies that ignored human nature. These policies eventually produced new hardships that destroyed the idealistic leaders and created conditions for the emergence of new practical leaders. The cycle would then begin anew. This pattern revealed the third and most disturbing truth about human stupidity: it was not merely individual but collective, not merely temporary but eternal. Each generation believed it had learned from the mistakes of its predecessors while making new versions of the same fundamental errors. The specific details changed, new technologies emerged, different ideologies gained prominence, novel forms of organization appeared, but the underlying dynamics remained constant. Human beings consistently overestimated their own rationality while underestimating the power of emotion, self-interest, and group psychology in shaping their decisions. They reliably chose immediate benefits over long-term consequences, familiar comforts over necessary changes, and pleasing lies over uncomfortable truths. These were not temporary failings that could be corrected through better education or improved institutions. They were permanent features of human psychology that had to be accepted and managed rather than ignored or denied. The implications of this insight extended far beyond the realm of politics into every aspect of human existence. In matters of health, people consistently chose immediate pleasure over long-term well-being, despite abundant evidence about the consequences of their choices. In financial affairs, they repeatedly fell victim to obvious scams and speculative bubbles that promised unrealistic returns. In personal relationships, they consistently sabotaged their own happiness through predictable patterns of jealousy, betrayal, and self-deception. These failures were not the result of insufficient knowledge or inadequate reasoning ability. The information necessary to make better choices was generally available, and the logical processes required to evaluate that information were well within the capabilities of most individuals. The problem lay deeper, in the fundamental architecture of human motivation and cognition that prioritized immediate emotional satisfaction over abstract logical analysis. The wise ruler learned to work with these realities rather than against them. Instead of trying to educate people out of their natural tendencies, he structured choices so that their instinctive responses would produce beneficial outcomes. Instead of relying on appeals to reason and moral duty, he crafted incentives that aligned self-interest with collective good. Instead of expecting consistency and principled behavior, he prepared for fickleness and opportunism while positioning himself to benefit from both. This approach required a profound shift in perspective that most people found deeply disturbing. It meant abandoning cherished beliefs about human dignity and potential in favor of a more modest but realistic assessment of human capabilities and limitations. It meant accepting that the goal of governance was not to inspire people to become better than they were, but to create conditions under which their existing nature would produce acceptable results. The resistance to this perspective was itself a manifestation of human stupidity. People preferred comforting illusions about their own rationality and goodness to accurate assessments that might require them to modify their behavior or lower their expectations. They would rather fail while maintaining their self-image than succeed by acknowledging uncomfortable truths about themselves and others. This preference for flattering falsehoods over humbling truths created opportunities for those willing to exploit it. The successful demagogue learned to tell people what they wanted to hear about themselves while quietly implementing policies based on more realistic assessments of human nature. The effective merchant discovered that customers would pay premium prices for products that reinforced their self-image while delivering minimal actual value. The skilled diplomat found that he could achieve his objectives by allowing his counterparts to believe they were demonstrating superior wisdom and virtue while actually serving his interests. Yet this exploitation of human weakness came with its own dangers and limitations. Those who made their careers from pandering to popular delusions could find themselves trapped by the very lies they had promoted. The demagogue who built his power base on impossible promises would eventually face the reckoning when those promises could not be fulfilled. The merchant who succeeded through deception would discover that his reputation for dishonesty limited his ability to make the genuine deals necessary for long-term success. The most successful practitioners of realpolitik learned to balance exploitation of human weakness with genuine service to human needs. They understood that sustainable power required delivering actual benefits to their subjects, not merely the illusion of benefits. They recognized that lasting success depended on creating systems that functioned effectively over time, not just tactics that produced immediate advantages. This balance between cynicism and service represented the highest form of political wisdom, the ability to see people as they truly were while still working to improve their condition within the constraints of their nature. It required neither the naive optimism that expected people to transcend their limitations nor the bitter pessimism that saw those limitations as reasons for abandonment or exploitation. The prince who achieved this balance could accomplish remarkable things. He could lead societies through crises that would destroy leaders who relied on appeals to virtue or reason alone. He could implement reforms that improved people's lives without triggering the resistance that typically greeted change. He could maintain stability in an unstable world by understanding and working with the forces that others either ignored or condemned. As dawn approached and the candle burned low, Machiavelli considered the personal cost of such wisdom. To see human nature clearly required a kind of moral isolation that few could tolerate. It meant accepting that most of one's contemporaries would never understand or appreciate the insights that made effective leadership possible. It meant being condemned as cynical by idealists who preferred beautiful failures to ugly successes. Yet this isolation was the price of effectiveness in a world where effectiveness was often the difference between prosperity and poverty, between peace and war, between the survival and destruction of entire communities. The leader who refused to acknowledge human stupidity might maintain his moral self-regard, but he would also bear responsibility for the suffering that resulted from his ineffective policies. The true tragedy of human stupidity was not that it existed, that was simply a fact of nature, no more lamentable than gravity or death. The tragedy was that its existence was so systematically denied by those who possessed the intelligence and education to recognize it. This denial perpetuated cycles of failure that could have been avoided through more honest assessment and more realistic planning. The educated classes, who should have been the natural repository of practical wisdom, were often the most resistant to acknowledging the limitations of human rationality. Their investment in idealistic theories about human potential blinded them to the evidence of human behavior that surrounded them daily. They would rather attribute failures to external circumstances or insufficient virtue than question their fundamental assumptions about human nature. This intellectual pride was itself a form of stupidity, perhaps the most dangerous form because it was reinforced by apparent learning and sophisticated reasoning. The brilliant fool who could construct elaborate justifications for his failed policies was more dangerous than the simple fool who at least recognized his limitations. The former would persist in destructive behavior while feeling virtuous about it, while the latter might at least be open to practical guidance. The pattern repeated itself across centuries and cultures with depressing regularity. Revolutionary movements would emerge promising to transform human nature through new forms of organization or ideology. Their leaders would genuinely believe that they had discovered the key to eliminating the selfishness, irrationality, and short-sightedness that had plagued previous generations. They would implement their theories with absolute conviction, only to discover that human nature remained stubbornly unchanged regardless of political arrangements or official ideology. The failure of these movements to achieve their transformative goals would then be attributed to sabotage by enemies, insufficient commitment by followers, or the corrupting influence of old institutions. The possibility that the goals themselves were unrealistic would be considered too painful to contemplate. New theories would be developed to explain the failures without challenging the fundamental assumption that human nature was infinitely malleable given the right conditions and incentives. This cycle of idealistic overreach followed by explanations that preserved core illusions was itself predictable to anyone who understood human psychology. People needed to believe that their failures were temporary setbacks rather than inevitable consequences of flawed premises. They needed to maintain hope that future efforts would succeed where past efforts had failed. They needed to preserve their self-image as rational agents capable of learning from experience and improving their condition through conscious effort. These needs were so powerful that they could override even direct experience of failure. Individuals who had personally witnessed the collapse of idealistic movements would often throw their support behind new movements making identical promises. They would convince themselves that this time would be different, that the new leaders had learned from previous mistakes, that changed circumstances made success more likely. The wise observer learned to recognize these patterns without being seduced by them. He understood that human hope and human stupidity were closely related phenomena, both involving the triumph of desire over evidence. He appreciated the functional value of hope in motivating effort and sustaining morale during difficult periods, while remaining realistic about its limitations as a guide to policy and planning. This perspective required a delicate balance between engagement and detachment that few could maintain. Complete cynicism led to paralysis and despair, while naive optimism led to repeated disappointment and ineffective action. The effective leader needed to retain enough hope to inspire others and justify his own efforts, while maintaining enough realism to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed his predecessors. The cultivation of this balance was perhaps the highest form of education, not the accumulation of facts or the mastery of abstract theories, but the development of practical wisdom about human nature and its implications for action in the world. This education could not be achieved through books alone, though books could provide useful frameworks and examples. It required direct experience with human behavior in all its complexity and contradiction. The prince who sought such education needed to study not only the great works of political philosophy but also the actual behavior of people under various conditions. He needed to observe how individuals responded to different incentives and pressures, how groups formed and dissolved, how institutions evolved and adapted over time. Most importantly, he needed to test his theories against reality and modify them based on results rather than wishful thinking. This empirical approach to understanding human behavior was revolutionary in its implications. It suggested that political wisdom was more like medical knowledge based on careful observation of symptoms and treatment outcomes than like mathematical knowledge based on logical deduction from first principles. Just as a physician learned to diagnose and treat diseases by studying actual patients rather than theoretical constructs, the political leader learned to govern effectively by studying actual human beings rather than idealized abstractions. The medical analogy was particularly apt because it suggested that human folly was like disease, a natural phenomenon that could be understood, predicted, and managed but never eliminated entirely. Just as physicians learned to work with the body's natural healing processes rather than against them, wise rulers learned to work with human nature's actual tendencies rather than fighting to transform them into something they were not. This acceptance of human limitation was not resignation but realism. It opened the door to more effective interventions precisely because it was based on accurate assessment rather than wishful thinking. The physician who understood the actual causes of disease could develop treatments that worked, while the one who insisted on treating imaginary causes would remain ineffective regardless of his good intentions. Similarly, the ruler who understood the actual motivations of his subjects could craft policies that achieved their intended effects, while the one who insisted on appealing to motivations that existed only in theory would fail regardless of the nobility of his goals. The difference between success and failure often lay not in the worthiness of one's objectives but in the accuracy of one's understanding of the means available to achieve them. As the morning light began to filter through the shutters of his study, Machiavelli gathered his thoughts for the final portion of his meditation on human stupidity and its political implications. The third great truth that had emerged from his years of observation and reflection concerned the relationship between knowledge and action, between understanding and effectiveness. Many learned men possessed accurate knowledge about human nature and its limitations, yet failed to translate that knowledge into effective action. They could analyze the mistakes of historical figures with brilliant precision while making similar mistakes in their own lives. They could diagnose the flaws in others' reasoning while remaining blind to their own cognitive biases. They could teach others about the importance of realistic planning while pursuing unrealistic goals themselves. This gap between knowledge and practice was not merely a matter of hypocrisy or weakness of will, it reflected deeper problems in how human beings processed information and made decisions. Intellectual understanding operated through different psychological mechanisms than practical judgment, and the two did not automatically reinforce each other. Someone could have a sophisticated theoretical grasp of human motivation while remaining emotionally naive about how those motivations would affect his own relationships and endeavors. The problem was compounded by the tendency of intellectual analysis to create a false sense of detachment from the forces being studied. The scholar who spent his days analyzing the irrationality of others could easily convince himself that his superior understanding made him immune to similar irrationality. The philosopher who wrote brilliantly about the dangers of pride and ambition could remain unconscious of how these same forces shaped his own behavior. This intellectual hubris was particularly dangerous because it was often accompanied by genuine insights that seemed to validate the scholar's sense of superiority. The fact that he could see things that others missed reinforced his belief that he was fundamentally different from the subjects of his study. He failed to recognize that his very ability to analyze human folly might itself be a product of the same cognitive processes that produced folly in others. The practical implications were profound. Advisors who possessed accurate theoretical knowledge about governance could give consistently bad advice because they failed to account for their own psychological limitations. Reformers who understood the flaws in existing institutions could design new institutions that replicated those flaws in subtler forms. Teachers who grasped the principles of human learning could employ pedagogical methods that violated those very principles. The solution was not to abandon intellectual analysis but to supplement it with rigorous self-examination and empirical testing. The wise counselor learned to question his own assumptions as relentlessly as he questioned those of others. He sought feedback on his recommendations and modified his theories based on results rather than defending them regardless of outcomes. Most importantly, he remained humble about the limitations of his understanding even as he strove to improve it. This humility was perhaps the most difficult virtue for intelligent people to cultivate. Their superior analytical abilities provided genuine advantages that could easily translate into unwarranted confidence about their overall judgment. They could solve complex problems that baffled others, predict outcomes that others missed, and identify solutions that others overlooked. These successes naturally reinforced their faith in their own rational capabilities. Yet these same successes could become traps that prevented further learning and growth. The counselor who had given good advice in the past might resist updating his methods when circumstances changed. The theorist whose ideas had proven useful in one context might insist on applying them in inappropriate situations. The leader whose strategies had worked with one group might fail to adapt them for different audiences. The capacity for such adaptation required not just intelligence but wisdom, the ability to recognize the limits of one's knowledge and adjust behavior accordingly. This wisdom was rare precisely because it required individuals to maintain cognitive flexibility even as they developed expertise and confidence. It demanded that they remain open to disconfirming evidence even as their past successes provided reasons for certainty. The cultivation of such wisdom was a lifelong process that could never be completed. Each new situation presented opportunities to refine understanding and improve judgment, but also risks of overconfidence and stagnation. The wise person learned to treat his own beliefs and methods as hypotheses to be tested rather than truths to be defended. He remained curious about outcomes even when they confirmed his expectations, alert for subtle changes that might signal the need for different approaches. This experimental attitude toward practical wisdom stood in sharp contrast to the dogmatic certainty that characterized most political discourse. Leaders and followers alike preferred the comfort of absolute convictions to the uncertainty of ongoing inquiry. They wanted to believe that they had found permanent solutions to permanent problems, that their understanding was complete and their methods perfected. This preference for certainty over accuracy was itself a manifestation of human stupidity, the tendency to prioritize psychological comfort over practical effectiveness. People would rather be confidently wrong than uncertainly right, rather fail with dignity than succeed through trial and error. They would rather maintain consistent positions than adapt to changing circumstances, rather defend their past decisions than acknowledge their limitations. The skilled prince learned to exploit these preferences while avoiding their traps. He could project confidence to inspire followers while privately maintaining flexibility about methods and goals. He could appear consistent while actually adapting continuously to new information and changed conditions. He could seem principled while actually being pragmatic about which principles to emphasize in different situations. This ability to maintain multiple levels of awareness simultaneously, public and private, tactical and strategic, immediate and long-term, was perhaps the most sophisticated political skill. It required not just intelligence but emotional discipline, not just analytical ability but performance skills, not just understanding of general principles but sensitivity to specific contexts. The development of such capabilities was necessarily a personal journey that could not be reduced to simple formulas or universal rules. Each individual brought different strengths and weaknesses to the task of leadership, different experiences and perspectives that shaped his understanding of human nature. What worked for one person in one situation might fail for another person in similar circumstances. Yet beneath this diversity of individual approaches lay common patterns and principles that could be identified and studied. The successful princes of history had typically possessed certain shared characteristics: realistic assessment of human nature, flexibility in methods while maintaining consistency in goals, ability to project strength while remaining internally adaptable, skill in managing the gap between public rhetoric and private calculation. These characteristics could be cultivated through study and practice, though they could never be guaranteed. The aspiring leader could learn from the examples of others while recognizing that he would ultimately need to develop his own synthesis of techniques and approaches. He could master general principles while remaining alert to the specific requirements of his particular context and challenges. The ultimate test of such preparation was not theoretical understanding but practical results. The prince who truly comprehended the nature of human stupidity would be able to govern effectively over time, maintaining stability while adapting to change, inspiring loyalty while remaining realistic about its limits, achieving his objectives while helping others achieve theirs. Such success was rare precisely because it required the integration of so many different capabilities and the avoidance of so many natural traps. It demanded intellectual honesty about human nature combined with emotional intelligence about human motivation. It required strategic thinking about long-term consequences combined with tactical skill in immediate situations. It needed principled commitment to worthy goals combined with pragmatic flexibility about methods. Most people who aspired to leadership possessed some of these qualities while lacking others. They might have excellent analytical skills but poor emotional intelligence, strong principles but weak implementation abilities, clear strategic vision but limited tactical capabilities. The few who managed to develop the full range of required capacities typically did so through extensive experience with failure as well as success, through honest self-examination as well as external learning. The greatest danger for such individuals was the temptation to become cynical about human nature rather than simply realistic about it. The constant exposure to human weakness and folly could easily lead to contempt rather than understanding, to exploitation rather than service. The prince who lost sight of the positive potential within human limitations would eventually lose the capacity to inspire and lead effectively. The proper attitude was neither naive optimism nor bitter pessimism but compassionate realism, the ability to see people as they actually were while still caring about their welfare and potential for improvement within natural constraints. This perspective allowed for effective leadership without moral compromise, for practical success without spiritual corruption. As Machiavelli concluded his lengthy meditation, he understood that he had not discovered new truths about human nature but had simply articulated clearly what observant people had always known but rarely admitted. The insights that seemed so radical to his contemporaries would have been obvious to successful leaders throughout history, even if they had lacked the intellectual framework to express them systematically. The real contribution of his analysis was not novelty but honesty, the willingness to state explicitly what others knew implicitly but dared not say publicly. By bringing these uncomfortable truths into the open, he hoped to create the possibility for more effective governance based on accurate rather than wishful assessment of human capabilities and limitations. The ultimate irony was that this honest acknowledgement of human stupidity might itself represent a form of wisdom that could improve human condition. By accepting what could not be changed about human nature, leaders might become more effective at changing what could be modified. By working with natural human tendencies rather than against them, societies might achieve better outcomes even while maintaining realistic expectations about their citizens. This was perhaps the most hopeful conclusion that could be drawn from such a grim analysis, that clear sight and honest assessment, however uncomfortable, provided the foundation for whatever genuine improvement was possible in human affairs. The prince who truly understood the nature of human stupidity would be better positioned to serve human welfare than one who insisted on maintaining beautiful illusions about human perfectibility. The sun had fully risen by the time Machiavelli set down his pen, having completed his meditation on the unforgiving truths that govern human behavior. The lessons were harsh but necessary, the insights disturbing but potentially liberating for those with the courage to accept them. In a world shaped by human folly, Perhaps the greatest wisdom lay in understanding that folly so clearly that it might finally be transcended, not through transformation of human nature but through more skillful navigation of its permanent limitations and eternal possibilities.